Hello, here we are once again with you to talk about purpose, to talk about vision, mission, stories that transform lives based on this book called The Yes Effect. Stories of people who did something around their country, their society, and their neighborhoods. People who produced a transformation in many people. And the author of this book, as you know, throughout this series is Luis Bush. Hi, Luis. This time I see you with your wife, Doris. Thank you for being with us here once again. I want to start with the story of your life. How many years have you been married? 47 years. And children? We have 4 children. Grandchildren? 20. 20! You've navigated through different countries. It's been a life of many years. You've seen stories of transformation of people in the most amazing places. The Middle East, Europe, Latin America. And with all those demands on your time, I can't help but ask you this question. How do you manage that intense schedule between work and family life, with a life of raising children and educating children? After children are no longer children, they're teenagers, they're adults, but they still need you there. Tell us a little about that. Well, we started to travel more, in my case, after our children were a little older. At least, I remember our youngest child was maybe 5 when I started traveling more. I was in business first in Chicago, and later as a pastor in El Salvador, and about 4 years in Dallas. And during those first years of that period, I was very dedicated to where we lived. But later, little by little, starting at the end of the 90s, I started to travel more. And it was important to always be able to care for our children. And I was grateful for my dear wife, who was very dedicated, but it was very difficult. I remember once it was very difficult for her to see me leave with one of our daughters who was sick. Yes, at the beginning of the 80s, when we were in El Salvador, and Luis was the pastor of a growing church there, suddenly came the vision of missions, that we as Latin American countries also needed to be involved in missions. And Luis began to travel to different countries to encourage that vision, culminating in 1987 with Comibam in Brazil. And it was then that it was hard for me with small children, with the church, and Luis was coming and going. But he said to me, "Look, I can't go without your blessing." So during that night, I remember very well that in spite of being unanimous in what we were doing, this new idea of leaving and traveling throughout all of Latin America, Spain and Portugal, was very difficult for me. And it was a struggle that night for me, until that night God reminded me of a verse in the Bible, in the book of Esther, in the Old Testament. Esther 4:14. And Luis had asked me for my blessing, and in this verse it says, "For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish." And who knows but that you've come to your royal position for such a time as this. And I felt that God was speaking to me in that moment because, like Queen Esther, I had entered into the kingdom of God. And I was enjoying being a pastor's wife very much. And suddenly the call comes to travel more. And he asked me for only one thing, my blessing. So when God reminded me that night of the Esther 4:14 verse, I said, "Lord, this is for me. I must give him my blessing because I want to be part of what my husband is doing." And there it was. So I went and told him the next day, "Luis, I give you my blessing and let's move forward." You were living in El Salvador when this happened. So your family, biological family, wasn't around. And so it was more difficult because when you have your family close by, you feel more accompanied. And on top of that, it's also a country which, that I understand, up until today, must have one of the highest levels of crime. It's a country that's unsafe. Therefore, that decision or that process that you particularly had to go through at some point had to have created moments of differences of opinion or friction. And how was that? And how did you finally overcome it? Well, honestly, I feel that with that answer from God in the Bible, with that verse, that He was telling me, I'm going to be with you up to the end, and I'm going to take care of Luis. In other words, I felt the security of that. And so that's how it was. And you know what happened, Agustin? My fear was that since Luis was going to be leaving, the children weren't going to have that time with him, and that the church was going to suffer. But it was quite the contrary. Luis came back and brought news from other countries. Look what God is doing over in Chile. Look at what God is doing in Ecuador. And he also brought missionaries with him sometimes. So our children began to hear about missions and to learn about other people, other countries. In other words, their horizons opened much more for them and also for the church. When someone is developing this kind of Christian activity in many countries, when the kids are growing up, because it's different when they're children. Somehow there are certain things that they don't quite notice so much, except for the absence of a parent who they miss. But when they get into their teenage years and further into adolescence, there are other types of problems. And it would be interesting to know how you managed that process. Because so often we hear stories of people like you that have ended up with a serious conflict in their marriage. And some have even ended up with broken families, and even in conflicts with their children. What would be the principles or the lessons that you learned and mistakes you made? Because how you cut down on those problems is important, but it's not easy with an agenda like that. Well, in the first point, you're right. As children, we, the parents, especially the dad, we're a bit restless by nature. So that's something that anyone could use as an excuse for their mischievous behavior. But what we discovered in the beginning is that if they were to experience what life is in missions themselves, how other people live, and what it's like to be in a structure or with people who they can be themselves with and develop a new vision, which could also contribute to that vision. So starting from very young, they begin to go for a period of time, especially during summer vacation, which is about 3 months, and that's a long time to be at home alone. So they went to stay for a while in other parts of the world and see how children live and to help and collaborate. And that was transformative for them. In other words, even today, they look back on those experiences. They remember those experiences, and they're grateful for having been there and seen and sensed the realities, and having been able to leave the house for a while. Many people can't tell the same success story, people who have worked in the same field as you. And I feel like this is good advice. Involve them in the work themselves. But children, some have a vocation for that and others don't. And at some point they say, Dad, Mom, I think what you do is great, but my life is going in a different direction. And that's where some crisis situations are born. Did you experience that with your children? And how did it work out? And finally, how were they able to move forward out of the crisis as well? The response to the first one is yes. Do you want to tell more about that? Yes, it's true, but keeping that door of communication open as wide as possible so that they can feel free to express themselves and speak with us, and to look for ways to connect with them. So I think that a difficult time for us was when we left El Salvador and went to live in Guatemala for a year to prepare for Comibam 1987. Because they were in love with El Salvador. They didn't want to leave the church. They didn't want to leave the country. So especially the youngest one, Daniel. He insisted that he wanted to be in Guatemala, but we eventually found that all four wanted to be in El Salvador and not leave. So the one who had the most influence was the oldest, Janine. And so we tried to talk with her and convince her to go to Guatemala, because we needed to be there for a year, preparing for the Comibam conference. So we said, Janine, please be a little happier that we're here and in the same culture. But I left all my friends, says Janine. So we tried, and we had a little success, didn't we? But not much. And then came the second, Stephanie, and we had the same experience. I mean, she was thinking of her friends, and she wasn't convinced about being in Guatemala. Third, Naomi, we thought she could be a little more committed to the change, but we found she wasn't. And we got to a point where our only hope was in little Daniel. So there he was, and we told him to go to his sisters and say that he was happy and glad to be there. He was already outside playing soccer with the neighbors. He was doing his little pranks, nothing serious, but pranks with the neighbors. He was already at home in some way in Guatemala. But in their heart of hearts, all four wanted to go back to El Salvador. I want to pause you there just a minute. This book is called The Yes Effect. When we see and understand, or maybe perceive, that God is calling us to a mission, but when you have four children that are telling you no, the no effect, somehow, did you think at some point that going to that place wasn't the right decision if you had so much opposition from inside your own family? You're right. In that moment, we thought that it was the right way and it was the route we had to take. And we thought it would be a matter of days that they would be getting used to Guatemala. And we thought that Daniel would be our hope, that he was going to change. But he came back saying, I want to go back to El Salvador too. So we did have that crisis, but what made us feel quite at home, because they had many bombs there in El Salvador at that time when we left, from 6 in the afternoon until 6 in the morning, because there was quite a moment of crisis in the country. But we found in Guatemala, when we went to Guatemala City, that same day, almost the second or third day we were in the country, there was a crisis situation. We had to find shelter in a store because there was an uproar that was happening in the street. There was a protest. So they saw that this can happen anywhere that you find yourself. And they came back with a slightly different mindset. And little by little, it wasn't immediate, but little by little they got used to it. They started to go to school there in Guatemala for 1 year, and they made new friends. And although they weren't completely in favor of the change, little by little, they started to adapt, and they started to think us. Going back to the first years you were in El Salvador, when you had to adapt to a country which is entirely different from the one you came from, to a different culture and a new experience, it's a country that also from a safety point of view, I go back to the issue of safety, it's a problem in that country. And I understand that in those early years, particularly you, Doris, went through a little process of resistance to some situations that you lived, because you were threatened in some way. Yes, that was almost the third year we were living there. We felt very at home. We were very happy. The families from the church were very precious to us. Especially arriving there, we felt the warmth from the families of the church. They loved children, and we arrived with 3 girls. And soon they were playing with the young girls of the church and the other children in the neighborhood, and so we were very at ease at the beginning. After a year, more or less, we began to feel that under the surface, in the country, there was this underlying feeling of unrest. And protests started popping up in the city of San Salvador, and those shootings and bombs in the morning and at night. It was the period of the Civil War in El Salvador. Yes, it began the year after we arrived, in 79. There was a call from the university that was near our house where they were permitted to announce the protests, crying out for the people to respond to this call to revolution. So it was almost a year after we arrived that the concerns and the uproar started there. So what happened? Well, around that time, our son was born in 79, and then Luis was being invited to different parts of the country to preach. So he was in a city on a day that's to commemorate the soldiers. Do you remember the name of the city? Chalatenango, right? Chalatenango. And he shared the gospel there, right there in an open place. And 2 days later, we began to get phone calls at home. A few anonymous calls that would ring and we would pick up, and the line would go dead. So finally, a voice spoke up and said to the lady who helped us at the house, a lady from our church who worked in our home, but the voice said, "Tell Luis that he has 48 hours to leave the country or he'll suffer the consequences." So I thought, well, I love this country, I love the people, but I don't think that we have to go through that. So right away, we prayed together, we asked God for guidance. And Luis sat down in the living room when he heard that and said, "God brought us here, and that's not the way He's going to get us out of here." So there was a division between us, because I only saw the way out, and he saw himself staying there. You saw the coffin, and he saw something else. Yes. And the good thing is that he felt that we were under the authority of the elders of the church. And so they began to pray that night, and they continued the next day. And then, thank God, they said, we have a fund for pastors who are going through some difficulty, and they can go to stay in a hotel for a week. Taking ownership of the title of this book, I love the yes effect. For all the people who want to have a purpose in life that has an impact, what's the yes effect of your lives? If you had to define a particular situation in all the story that you have as a married couple after 47 years of marriage, to say, this was a call that was relevant in my life. Maybe you each have a different one. But that you can say, that instance was the yes effect. I believe that moment was maybe one of the most important yes effects for us. The one you're telling us. The one we're telling now, because we weren't in full agreement of the yes effect together. But it was more in my case. So that was the definition for us of the most important yes effect for our marriage and for the future of our family and what to do in life. So then we had a few days in Guatemala because we had a commitment to attend a seminar sharing the word. And after that moment, we still didn't agree. And it was in that week that the two of us were really crying out to God because we didn't really have another place to cry out. And we sought God together, Lord, give us unity as a couple. And it was there that God gave us 4 life principles, which allowed us for the first time in that situation to agree. And those principles have helped us for the rest of our lives to say yes to God. What were those 4 principles? The 4 principles, do you want to talk about them? Yes. Our guidebook is the Bible, so we're guided based on different principles there. And the first is based on the example of Abraham and Sarah in the Old Testament. They lived in tents. And when God said, well, we're going to move out of the place where they lived, they obeyed. And they took down the tent and moved. So the first principle is not to let roots grow too deeply in any place. The other three all begin with the letter F, so it's easier to remember them. The second was finality. Wait a minute, I want to focus on the first one because some people may have differences with that point. Some people say that they were called to set down deep roots in that place and die in that place. And that's also a respectable point of view, because deep down I was called to conquer that land and that country, and there, maybe even in the same country where I was born. So I could say that, well, I'm not necessarily called to be a wanderer, to put it in other words. No, the idea is not to put our focus or our dependence on a place, because we have to be ready if God wants to move us to somewhere else. And so, for us, absolutely. It's different for other people, maybe. Where you stay here, and here is where I want to use you, and from here you shall not move. But for us, it was different, because we had already moved several times. From South America to North America, and from North America to Central America, we had already moved a lot. And what was the second principle? Second was finality, which means that we must have a final goal in life. In our individual case, having given our lives to Christ, Christ is our final goal. In other words, that the voice of Christ through the Word of God was to guide our commitments and our future agenda. Not only what to allow into the agenda, but also deciding where to do each thing on the agenda. And the third was flexibility. That is, if we're in a place, we should be flexible and not be so rooted down so deeply, but to be flexible in order to be able to move, right? And within finality was fidelity. Fidelity has to do with uniting ourselves to a commitment with a church or an entity, an organization, in which we can say that we're committed to this goal that this organization has. Let's develop that point a little more. If you were able to stick to those principles, even in the differences, even when there was no consensus between your differences to make a decision, did you have a pact to submit it to a council of reliable men or women, and with what they determined you could make a decision together, and therefore have no differences? Right. That was a pact between us which helped us arrive at an agreement. That's why I feel that maybe the first yes effect you asked about, because this one, yes, was very important, but there was a previous one, I think, and that was when God touched our lives for us to give our lives first to Him, and then what He wanted us to do with the rest of our lives, committed to what He would say through His Word and His revelation. Yes, because when He called us from your job in Chicago, I was working in Chicago at the beginning of our marriage with a very special company, and they were training you to go back to Brazil, but we both felt in that moment that He was calling us, that we were being called, and so we couldn't look back. In that case, the decision was easy, because you each agreed with each other. You felt the same call, but sometimes it's not. Because sometimes one says, I believe that we're not supposed to go to Guatemala. I think we have to stay in El Salvador. So when you have to make the decision and there's no agreement in that, you put into effect the third principle, which says to seek counsel. I imagine from a network of people who you submit the decision to, and they help you focus and make a unanimous decision. Is that correct? Correct. It's very important. And we've had that network that you mentioned, which are men who have gone before us. They're older people, they're quite older, and they've been part of this network for 33 years to, well, in English the word we use is accountability. I don't know how to say it in Spanish. It's a term used in companies when you have to report, make a report of your behavior in many technical aspects. Right. So these men of God, that we've decided to report these new directions or intentions that we have in our hearts when we want to move to a new place or a new job or ministry, we always went to them. So we met every month for all these years. Nowadays it's every 3 months. And the one who's the president of this little committee is 91 years old. And he keeps insisting. And they've provided timely counsel for us and helped us in a number of cases, different situations, and also opportunities. In some opportunities that we've been presented, they've said it may not be a good idea for this reason. And we've always followed their advice when they all agree and they're unanimous. Doris, what do you admire the most about Luis? Everything, right? I like everything about him. If you had to choose one characteristic, one virtue. Well, I think maybe how I met him for the first time. He was playing rugby when I met him, with so much strength, and he was absolutely set on the goal, and he was going directly to it. He was mowing down his opponents. No, I don't want to talk about mowing down opponents, but rather about making the goal, right? Yes, yes, well, but I feel that we're moving toward a goal, because he's a man of vision. Not only in the game of rugby, but also in the mission field, in the field of serving God. In any place, he's a man of vision. He goes with a vision. He doesn't go after any other thing, but rather he has a vision from God about what he's doing. And so for that. And you, Luis, what do you admire most about her? Well, Doris is a life partner. She's been with me, and I've been with her. And the children that we've shared, and family life, now the grandchildren. So it's the fellowship. It's the friendship. I admire her convictions in life. And I also agree with her emphasis, her own life in relation to family. She's been so active since we had the first child until today with grandchildren. She's very involved with the grandchildren. And I see that she's a woman of faith, a woman of confidence, a woman dedicated to the family. So there are several qualities. I think that this question is a little more complex, but it's an important one, because your story can be useful for a lot of people as a lesson and also as a challenge. What was the hardest moment, the most difficult, the saddest thing in your life story? I believe one moment was the loss of a child who was on its way. Two. We lost 2 children. Someone told us that they're waiting for us in heaven, so we're eager to meet those 2 babies. And I think the other, as a category of difficulty, would be whom we don't agree with each other. That's very hard for us, because we don't always agree on everything. So getting to that point of agreement, when we didn't start there, is a process. It's not always easy. Sometimes it's really hard. Yes, and also to see our children suffer or feel sad for some reason. That's also hard for us. But we thank God for each one of them, and that they love God, and that they're walking with Him. But that's difficult. And we're living close to our children now. So we have that same expectation for our grandchildren. And the biggest failure? Well, there are many. So to think about the biggest one, failure in what sense? Failure is a word that seems to be negative, but I want to give it a positive connotation also. It's when you make a mistake, or maybe didn't discern deep enough. But it's an opportunity to make things better, and you realize, I wouldn't have done it that way. We always make mistakes in the story of our work, in all areas of our lives as human beings. But there are failures that really stand out, and I wouldn't do it again. Do you have any in particular? There are so many that stand out to me, I can't choose just one. Maybe Doris can think of one. Well, there's one where we had lots of ambition and a desire to have a meeting at the end of the year 2000 in Jerusalem. We had been invited to have a celebration in Jerusalem, Messiah celebration, to celebrate the Lord Jesus. They had invited us, both Arab and Jewish believers, to culminate the AD 2000 movement there in Jerusalem. Why is it called AD 2000? Because the idea was for the church to plant a church in every ethnic group in the world by the year 2000, and for the gospel to be presented to each person all over the world. That was the goal. Perfect. Doris, and how does the story continue? So we had been planning this for a long time, for the end of the year 2000. So we already had the invitations. They had already gone out. People were coming from many different countries around the world. We had the authority to bring all these people into Israel. The director of tourism signed for each country all over the world, including the Arab countries, could enter for this event. And Luis and I thought that it would be better for us to not just arrive for the event, but to arrive around 2 or 3 months before, let's say in September, and to have everything ready for this meeting that we were going to have. And a month before we were supposed to go, an intifada rose up. The second big intifada began. And it was very dangerous to go out to the streets, and many tours that were already programmed canceled, the secular tours as well as church-related tours. But our group wanted to come despite all that, all the people from other countries. So what happened? At the beginning of December, the Home Secretary, the one who grants visas, went on strike. So we said, now it's very possible that we're going to have to cancel, because we're not going to have visas for all these people coming from other countries. And we waited and waited, and they told us, it'll be finished soon, it'll be over soon. But the date was coming up very quickly. And so we had to finally say, we're going to have to cancel. And that was really hard. Then came the promise, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. And the fruit that came after was much more than that grain that fell. God fulfilled that promise. I want to close with the following question, particularly for you, Doris. Luis has an illness, which is leukemia. And in 2014, if I remember correctly, you were on your deathbed. And this is something you live with, and it seems that every year is a gift, a year of grace. But what does that process mean to you, having to live with that? What does it mean as a wife? I think any wife or husband dreams of falling asleep together one night indefinitely and go together at the same time. But what does it mean for you? What he's living with, what he has. Those times of crisis that you've had also. You've had to live through them with him. I've learned from Luis, because he decided not to do the treatment that the doctors offered. He wanted to try an alternative, another way, a more natural way. And yes, it was a huge blow when we found out. He looked very healthy, so how could it be that there was something not right in his blood? But it was. And so it's been a learning process for both of us. And Luis is very disciplined to take care of himself. He's very careful. And I feel that we've grown a lot through it. We've grown closer to God, to His will, and learning what helps, what doesn't help us, and also recognizing that each day is a gift of God, because here we are, simply by the grace of God. We thought that it would be less time. I think the best phrase I've heard from Luis was in 2011, when in an activity that we were participating in, I asked about his health. And he said, "All my tests say very bad, but I feel extraordinarily well." And I think that was a fantastic statement. And your story, which is also woven into parts of this book, the Yes Effect, can speak to us all. It's a story of challenges, a story of mistakes, how we learn from mistakes, a story that invites us to each do something for our neighbor, someone we see every day of our lives who lives with tragedy or pain.